How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, no, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good morning. The first item of business today is general questions, and our first question from Rona Mackay.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what its response to the UK Government's announcement that universal credit rollout will be delayed until 2024.
Minister Christina McKelvey.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is deeply concerned by the UK Government's decision to delay the managed migration of people onto universal credit until 2024. This latest delay will mean even more people having to move to universal credit when they have had a change in circumstances, and even fewer having a managed move which provides transitional protection to those who are not, and protection so that they're not made worse off. It's the second time this has happened, and instead of penalising people, the Department for Work and Pensions should use this delay to fix the flaws in this discredited system, including scrapping the two-child cap and the abhorrent rape clause, ending the debt and poverty-induced 5-week wait, and fixing those allowances for those people in Scotland.
Rona Mackay.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Delaying universal credit rollout to 2024 means more people will lose out in financial protection, saving the UK Government money at the expense of those who really need it. Universal credit has already inflicted hardship and increased food bank in my constituency. Does the Minister agree that the DWP must start providing transitional payments to anyone moving to universal credit, no matter if they're part of natural or managed migration?
Minister.
Yes, I do. The UK Government should take responsibility for the shambles that is universal credit, now 7 years behind schedule. It's absolutely critical that the Department for Work and Pensions immediately starts making these payments for everyone moving to universal credit in order to protect people's incomes and prevent even more hardship and poverty. And it says it all in Rona Mackay's question, Presiding Officer, when the UK Government say they will save money through this method. Well, they're not saving people's lives and livelihoods by treating them the way they're treating them.
Question number 2, Neil Bibby.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it will take to improve employment levels and economic growth.
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
Our employability service, Fair Start Scotland, is delivering personalised support to 16,130 people, helping them towards and into work, with 4,126 participants starting a job since launch in April 2018. Following the publication of No One Left Behind, we're working with local government, the third sector, private sector, to develop an employability system that builds on existing services, improves alignment and integration with other support, and which are designed and delivered around the needs of those using services.
Neil Bibby.
In 2010, the Scottish Government boasted that it could create nearly 30,000 jobs in offshore wind energy by 2020. Today's Daily Record reports that that actual number is closer to 1,700. We agree the UK Government needs to reform the subsidy mechanisms to demand greater UK content in supply chains. But can the Minister outline what capital investment the Scottish Government has made to ensure that our fabrication facilities are fit to win work that is being sent to the likes of Indonesia and China? And is the Scottish Government's proposed cut to the workforce skills budget a sign that it is giving up on talk of tens of thousands of jobs?
Minister.
Well, no, it certainly isn't, and I'll come to that latter point in a moment. But of course, when this government was needed, we stepped up to the plate. When BIFAB was in trouble, we were there. We intervened, we helped save that yard, and of course we're undertaking work to support the Scottish supply chain. In answer to his last point, I would urge Mr Bibby to cast his eyes a bit wider across the budget, because he's looking at things in isolation. He's failed to mention that our Fair Start funding is up in this coming year. He's failed to mention that in the skills and training budget lines. Employability funding's up, the skills budget up, we're maintaining educational maintenance allowance. He's forgot, of course, to mention that there will be over £22 million extra in higher education this coming year. He's forgot to mention that further education is increasing by over £21 million this year. And he's singularly failed to mention our new parental employment support fund of £7 million. So we are investing in our workforce. I would have thought that was something Mr Bibby would welcome.
And Willie Cox.
Thank you. Innovative approaches to employment support are always essential effort to reach people who are furthest away from the labour market. Can the Minister provide information on any new ways in which the Scottish Government is looking to support people into work?
Minister.
Well, of course, I've just mentioned our Parental Employment Support Fund, which is a new approach to supporting a particularly vulnerable cohort of the population, to support them into employment, to tackle child poverty, something that Aileen Campbell is, of course, leading on. This is a cross-government approach. In terms of the wider approach, we're building on Fair Start Scotland, which is designed around the individual, a person-centred approach. The work we're taking forward in tandem with local government through the No One Left Behind agenda to better align the range of employability support with other public services, such as housing, such as social work, such as the criminal justice system, such as the health services, all designed towards that end. That's something this government is taking forward, and that's something that will make a difference to the people of Scotland.
Thank you. And question number 3, Stewart Stevenson.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the UK Government's proposed legislation on fishing and farming and the impact of this on Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
I welcome that DEFRA has chosen to work with us on the Fisheries Bill. The revised version is an improvement on the original draft and largely recognises, Presiding Officer, that fisheries is a devolved matter, although we still have some significant concerns in relation to the setting of fishing opportunities and failure to deal with the sea fish levy. On the UK's Agriculture Bill, we have serious concerns that there are provisions which impose unwanted policies and rules in areas of devolved competency, and that the bill makes no commitment to preventing post-Brexit trade deals from allowing the import of food that's produced to a lower standard than those legislated for Scottish farmers. Across both bills, I'll fight to ensure that the UK Government provides adequate funding for all sectors, and I will continue to resist any attempts by the UK Government to grab key powers from this Parliament that impact on fishing, farming and food production.
Stewart Stevenson.
Relatively good news on fishing then, but on farming, abysmal news, building on yesterday's announcement that we'll be denied access to labour from other countries, essentially. Can the Cabinet Secretary assure us that he will make this entire Parliament's view that we will brook no removal of powers related to farming, that farmers across Scotland have expressed grave concern about UK policies? He'll continue to champion the cause of farming in Scotland with those at Westminster who wish to see it diminished.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I will. Yes, I have. And yes, we did on Monday of this week at the Interministerial Group meeting, some of which took place in Northern Ireland with the welcome return of the administration there. And we will take every opportunity to protect the devolved competence and the powers of this Parliament, which, as Mr Stevenson says, are under attack from the Westminster Government, and that surely is unacceptable to all members of this Parliament.
Question number 4, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reported extended waiting times for general colorectal surgery in NHS Lothian.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
Under the Waiting Times Improvement Plan, we've made an additional £16.5 million available to NHS Lothian in this financial year. Since the summer of 2019, NHS Lothian have progressed a programme of work to improve waiting times within the colorectal department, including improving patient pathways, recruiting additional staff and running additional evening and weekly clinics to address the long waits.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
To the Cabinet Secretary for her reply. In July 2018, my constituent, Margaret Simpson, was injured in the Western General when a colonoscopy ruptured her bowel. She had to undergo emergency surgery. She had part of her bowel removed and was fitted with a stoma bag. She was placed on a waiting list to have corrective surgery that would have seen the bowel repaired and the stoma removed. She was sent home with pre-op medication to take in advance of the planned operation. In March last year, she received a letter apologising for the fact that she had not been seen within the 12-week waiting time guarantee. At Christmas, she had to throw out the pre-op medication because it had passed its use-by date. She is still waiting. Margaret's life has been on hold. Given that this is an injury caused by the NHS, does the Cabinet Secretary believe that nearly 2 years is an acceptable time for Margaret to wait for the NHS to make things right?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Cole-Hamilton for his supplementary and the specifics of the case that he is dealing with. No, I don't think that any wait that is longer than necessary is a sufficient answer and response from the board. If Mr Cole-Hamilton would care to give me the details of the particular case that he is talking about, then I'm very happy to look at that further and to see if NHS Lothian can move more swiftly to deal with Ms Simpson's particular situation.
Question number 5, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will fully fund the recent teachers' pay settlement to be delivered by councils in 2020-21.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's agreed contribution to the cost of the teachers' pay deal for 2021 is fully funded. Local authorities will receive a funding package of £11.3 billion in 2021 through the Local Government Finance Settlement. Included in this is an additional £156 million for the teachers' pay deal.
Brian Whittle.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but I was contacted by my councillors in East Ayrshire who tell me that the settlement they have received from the Scottish Government means they will have to cut their discretionary budget by £2 million to fund the Scottish Government's extra commitments, such as the teachers' pay settlement. Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government have left East Ayrshire and other councils with a bill to pay for your Government's commitments. Do you think that's a fair burden to lay at the feet of our councils?
Cabinet Secretary.
Local government has received a cash increase of £494 million in budget from the Scottish Government, which relates to a number of the issues that Mr Whittle has raised. And of course, local authorities are free to increase the council tax if they judge that appropriate to meet some of these costs. Of course, I remind Mr Whittle that a number of local authorities last year did not increase the council tax by the maximum amount that they were enabled to do, which must demonstrate that the government had fully funded local authority settlements. We are, of course, involved in a budget process, and I would also remind Mr Whittle that it's a bit rich for the Conservatives to raise any issue with me about local government funding when the Conservative government, the useless Conservative government that Mr Whittle supports in London, has delivered austerity on the people of Scotland for the last 10 years.
Question number 6, Miles Briggs.
So to ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had regarding the future rebuild of the Edinburgh Cancer Centre.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
So NHS Lothian continue to engage with both the Cancer Policy Team and the Capital Planning Team at Scottish Government as NHS Lothian develop their initial agreement for the Edinburgh Cancer Centre. There was a recent site visit before Christmas to see the plans for the regional centre, but also to look at the enhancement work underway on the current site, which includes the haematology unit, a new linear accelerator, refurbishment of the cancer assessment unit, refurbishment of inpatient wards and development in Ward 1. And the Scottish Government has plans to invest £20 million to support the provision of cancer services in the safe environment until the new Edinburgh Cancer Centre is ready.
Miles Briggs.
The Cabinet Secretary for that answer. 2 years ago I was told that the new cancer centre would be built in 2025. The Health Board are now telling me it's likely to be a decade before we see a new cancer centre. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm, will patients across the south east of Scotland cancer region have to wait 5 years or 10 years for a new cancer centre?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that would actually be a very appropriate question for NHS Lothian, who are the ones charged with this. Indeed, Mr Briggs, you know, you really need to understand how the health service works. You cannot have it both ways. And NHS Lothian are at level 4, as you know, something that you complain about. We are busy undertaking substantive work to ensure it has appropriate leadership, something you complain about. NHS Lothian are at stage 1 of their business case. That business case will come into Scottish Government. We will turn that around quickly, provided it is satisfactory. They will then move to outline business case, and as you know, outline business cases can take another 2 years to go through the process. So that is where we are, a timetable driven by NHS Lothian, not by this Government. Our commitment is clear. We are ready to support that. We are supporting the work that needs to be done in the interim in the existing cancer services to ensure that they are upgraded. And if you have further ideas and suggestions to make about how I can act to improve the performance of NHS Lothian, I am very happy to hear them.
Question number 7, John Mason.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what treatment programmes are available to help people addicted to gambling.
Sir Claire Hockey.
In common with other compulsive and addictive behaviours, problem gambling is addressed as part of wider health issues. Anyone who believes gambling is affecting their health or that of a loved one should consult their GP in the first instance. Out of hours, advice and support can be obtained from NHS 24 or from Breathing Space. The NHS Inform website also contains advice and signposting information. Where a person with addictive or compulsive behaviours is referred to a service for treatment, it may not be a specialist gambling addiction programme. The clinical team will work with that person to identify the issues or problems that are important to support the recovery and provide evidence-based treatment.
John Mason.
I thank the Minister for that reply. My understanding is that no Scottish Health Board has introduced a pre-planned treatment programme for gambling, and there is in Scotland no specialist clinic to treat them. Does the Minister think there is any need for such a facility?
Minister.
We will continue to consider evidence on what works best to address the issue of gambling harms in Scotland, and this includes work by the Scottish Public Health Network to develop and implement a whole population approach to prevention and reduction of gambling harms. This is currently being progressed with partners including NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Glasgow City Council and the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland. People with lived experience of gambling harms will be closely involved in co-producing a coordinated framework to underpin this work, and learning from this project will help inform the whole system approaches to addressing gambling harms in Scotland.
Thank you. Question number 8, David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what action it's taking to support the salmon industry following Brexit.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Stewart.
Presiding Officer, our vital farm salmon sector is a global success story, generating £540 million in GVA and offering over 10,000 jobs, often highly skilled, well-paid jobs, in some of our most remote communities. I will continue to support the salmon industry following Brexit, but the UK Government's lack of clarity on key issues such as market access and certification threatens this vital sector and damages investor confidence. The extra costs, extra risks and bureaucracy directly result from the UK Government's obduracy. They must heed the warning from the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, who have highlighted the huge unnecessary burdens that will result from the Brexit deal being pursued.
David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, last week the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation warned that without a close relationship and tariff-free trade with the EU, the industry could see £9 million on costs and delays to the departure of fresh fish. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that trade barriers with our biggest trading partner will damage the sector and businesses and put jobs at risk in the Highlands and Islands?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I very much agree with David Stewart as he sets out the position. The extra costs would result from the imposition of export health certificates and other bureaucracy. And let's be absolutely clear, there is no need for these at the moment at all. There would be no need for these if the UK Government agrees for dynamic alignment with the EU. They could remove the need for them. However, they have refused to do that. And on Monday, I asked George Eustace if the UK Government would pick up the tab for the extra £9 million or perhaps more that the trade body has estimated. Mr Eustace said that that would be a business cost. Business must pay this cost, resultant directly from the policies pursued by the UK Government. So, Presiding Officer, here we have it. This is the first Boris Brexit bill. And the industry are going to have to pay it directly because of the UK Government's Brexit policies.
Question number 9, Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when the Scottish Local Authorities Remuneration Committee last met.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
The Scottish Local Authorities Remuneration Committee was established to advise Scottish ministers on the payment by local authorities of remuneration allowances and reimbursement of expenses incurred by local authority councillors. I understand the committee last met in February 2012 and was stood down in February 2013. Since 2017, councillors' pay has increased annually in line with the percentage increase in the median annual earnings of public sector workers in Scotland. Councillors' pay will rise by 2.2% from April 1st, 2020.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for a reply. As a former councillor myself, I'm well aware of the hard work undertaken by the majority of councillors around the country. Clearly, not all councillors receive special responsibility allowance to top up their basic salaries, and full-time councillors on the basic level can sometimes struggle financially. Now, I understand this is a difficult ask in the current financial climate, and I'm aware of the 2.2% increase. However, will the Cabinet Secretary undertake to consider re-establishing SLARC with a view to bringing councillors' basic salary up to a level fit for purpose, which would make the prospect of serving the local communities post-2022 more rewarding and worthwhile, and be in line with the effort they put into the job?
Cabinet Secretary.
I absolutely recognise that councillors the length and breadth of the country work exceptionally hard and are dedicated to improving their communities, and the Scottish Government believes that everyone deserves to be fairly paid. And in terms of that fair work, we were delighted to lay amendments to increase flexibility available to local authorities when granting councillors paid leave of absence, something important in terms of encouraging councillors taking parental leave and encouraging other people to stand for council. As I said in my previous response, since 2017, councillors' pay has increased annually in line with the percentage increase in the median annual earnings of public sector workers in Scotland. I'm happy to meet with the member if he wants to discuss this further and outline some of the work that we're doing to support our councillors and our councils.
Thank you very much. And that concludes general questions. Now, before we turn to First Minister's questions, I'm sure members would like to join me in welcoming to our gallery Mr. Vegard Struman, Ambassador of Norway to the United Kingdom. Thank you very much. First Minister's questions now. Question number 1 from Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Police Federation, the Scottish Police Authority and the Association of Superintendents all say that this year's budget allocation for policing is wholly inadequate. Why is the First Minister ignoring these warnings?
First Minister.
Well, first of all, let me point out to Jackson Carlow and the Chamber that in the draft budget for the year ahead, we've committed an extra £42 million of funding for Police Scotland. That's a 3.6% increase. That includes an increase in resource funding to protect officer numbers, but it also includes an increase in capital funding. And I think that is important, and I think it's welcome. As the Deputy Chief Officer of Police Scotland, David Page, said recently, the draft funding settlement for policing in 2020-2021 includes an uplift of revenue funding of £37 million, which is £17 million higher than originally anticipated, something that we welcome. Stewart Carroll, the Association of Scottish Police Superintendents, in his submission to this Parliament's committee, said it is certainly welcome that the settlement includes an additional £37 million in the Police Scotland budget. Now, I recognise that in our police service, as across all of our public services, there is still an impact being felt of a decade of Tory austerity, and we will continue to work to protect the police and our other public services. We are in a budget process, and I say to the Conservatives, as I say to other parties across this chamber, if they want in the next stage of this process to bring forward credible proposals, then this government is willing to discuss them.
Jackson Carlow.
I think the First Minister needs to get up to speed with our government. We actually have come forward with credible proposals which have been communicated to our Finance Secretary. It's quite clear that neither she nor her government have come anywhere close to meeting the budget allocation that frontline officers and the SPA believe is needed to ensure a sustainable policing service. And the First Minister can dissemble all she likes, but this is what frontline police officers in Parliament today and deeply concerned by this issue are saying. The Chief Constable has personally made clear that Police Scotland need money to retain officers, begin to tackle the huge problems in the police estate, and give frontline officers the equipment they need to keep the public and themselves safe. But there is a black hole of £49 million in the Police Scotland's budget. First Minister, what is your advice to Police Scotland on how they should deal with this funding gap? Cut officer numbers, continue to let the ceilings fall down in police stations and much else besides, or fail to issue essential equipment?
First Minister.
And this government will continue to work closely with the Chief Constable and the Scottish Police Authority. Of course, this is the government that has maintained police numbers at 1,000 more than we inherited. Jackson Carlow is the representative of a party in the rest of the UK that cut police numbers by 20,000. So I think perhaps he should reflect on that. But, you know, I did say that we would listen to credible proposals. And I would remind the Chamber, Presiding Officer, that the Tories have presided over a real terms cut in the Scottish budget over the past decade of £1.5 billion. Jackson Carlow has regularly put forward proposals for tax cuts for the richest in this Parliament that would cut another £500 million out of the Scottish budget, and yet he comes forward with spending pleas that amount to hundreds of millions of pounds. We have delivered a budget that is fair, that focuses on protecting our public services, on growing the economy, on tackling the climate emergency, and we will talk to and listen, as we are doing, to other parties if they have credible suggestions to make. So I would perhaps say to Jackson Carlow to look again at the credibility of what he's coming forward with, and he will find in this government, and in particular in our new Finance Secretary, a government that is very willing to listen.
Jackson Carlow.
So we can get back to the problems facing Police Scotland, which you could actually do something about. The First Minister trumpets the budget settlement given to Police Scotland, so let's have a look at it in detail. The resource budget is still at least £13 million short of that which the police need just to stand still. And the capital budget is facing a real terms cut. And that's the second real terms annual cut in a row. And here's what Police Scotland say that means. The current capital allocation for policing is amongst the lowest in UK policing on a per capita basis, is low compared to other public bodies in Scotland, and will undoubtedly inhibit our ability to keep up with the threat, harm and risk posed to the people of Scotland from increasing crime. This is when the Scottish Government is receiving a funding uplift of £96 million from the UK Government investment for extra spending on policing. Why is she shortchanging Scotland's police officers?
First Minister.
The draft budget increases Police Scotland's budget by £42 million. If you look at the capital budget, in 2016-17, Police Scotland's capital budget was £20 million. In the draft budget that's just been published, it is £40 million. In other words, it has doubled in the space of a couple of years. That capital budget includes £5 million extra funding specifically requested by the service to accelerate its commitment to greening its fleet. So we will continue to do everything we can to protect our frontline police officers. And I would say again, we are doing this against the backdrop of a £1.5 billion austerity reduction in our budget imposed by the Conservatives, which means Jackson Carlaw and his colleagues have an absolute cheek standing up here talking about our public services. We will continue to put our public services first, and if Jackson Carlaw has got credible proposals to bring that he is also willing to say how should be funded, then of course we will always listen.
Jackson Carlaw.
Presiding Officer, hollow cries of "oh" from Richard Lyle do not pay for more police officers and do not pay for a broken police estate. The wider risk here is obvious, and it has been spelled out bluntly. It has been spelled out bluntly in Parliament this morning by the Scottish Police Federation to the Policing Subcommittee. Here's what they said. The police officers we represent are working harder than ever. They are under strain, and it is taking its toll on their physical and mental health and their families. Their working conditions are not satisfactory. In some cases, through no fault of our own, we are not providing a good service to the public. First Minister, isn't the choice clear? You increase police funding, or you are putting the public at risk.
First Minister.
Well, I lead a government that has kept police numbers at 1,000 more than the level we inherited, and we did that at a time when Jackson Carlaw's party slashed frontline police numbers by 20,000. That is the reality that every police officer across the UK is all too aware of. We're also making sure that our police officers get a decent pay rise, which is more than can be said of his colleagues south of the border. We have increased in this draft budget Police Scotland's funding. We will continue to listen to all proposals. So here's a challenge for Jackson Carlaw. Given the £1.5 billion Tory cut, given the £500 million that Jackson Carlaw would like to take out our budget to give in tax cuts to the richest in our society, given all of that, if Jackson Carlaw and his colleagues want to come forward and tell us where else in the budget we should cut funding in order to fund his proposals, then I am more than happy to listen. But he's got to say how they should be paid for, not just where he wants to spend more money.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, on Tuesday evening, I attended a public meeting in Salisbury. This is a community faced with the closure of their local GP surgery. Last year, the surgery was cut from 5 days to 3. Now, without any consultation, local people have been told that it will close completely at the end of March. The people of Salisbury know that if this surgery closes, they may never get it back. That's why on Tuesday night, they resolved to fight for its future. They want the First Minister's support. But in a letter to me, she washed her hands of it. Can the First Minister tell the people of Salisbury why she believes that the state of our National Health Service and the closure of GP surgeries is not a matter for her?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, it is absolutely right that patients should be able to see their GP when they need to. That's why we have a record number of GPs working in Scotland. We have more GPs per head of population in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. And of course, we are currently working to plans that will increase the number by at least 800 over the next few years. We expect health boards to engage and support patients wherever there are changes in circumstances to the services that they receive at the practice, and I would expect that to be the case in the GP practice that Richard Leonard refers to. GP practices in Scotland, or at least the vast majority
majority of GP practices in Scotland are independent bodies who are contracted to deliver services to the NHS. So we will continue to support primary care and GPs in particular, and will continue to encourage health boards to make sure that these services are always accessible.
Richard Leonard.
First Minister, promises of future numbers are little comfort to those communities facing cuts and closures to their GP services next month. And the truth is that the anger that I heard on Tuesday night is not limited to Salisbury. Across this Parliament, members of all parties are acutely aware of local GP services at high risk. Risk because of staff shortages, policy decisions and under-resourcing. Although perhaps that awareness does not extend to all members of this Parliament. Last week, another local community gathered at a packed public meeting to try and save their GP surgery from closure. But the local MSP apparently missed her invitation. Tarbolton is in the constituency of the Health Secretary. First Minister, if your own Cabinet Secretary for Health does not know about a GP closure in her own constituency, why on earth should people believe that your government is going to solve the GP crisis that patients are facing here in Scotland?
First Minister.
Obviously, important matters for communities across Scotland. That's why we are putting record funding into our National Health Service. It's why we have record numbers of people working in our National Health Service. Richard Leonard said it's not enough to talk about numbers in the future. There are more GPs working in the NHS now than was the case previously. The number of trainee doctors has increased by more than 10% since 2007. We've got an increased number of GP training places. We've got a number of recruitment initiatives across the country for doctors in general and for general practice in particular. We have a new GP contract in place, which of course was agreed with the BMA to tackle some of the challenges that they are facing. So these are the steps we are taking in practice to tackle these challenges. And I say, as I said a moment ago, we've got more GPs in Scotland per head of population than any other part of the UK. And I'll point out to Richard Leonard, that also includes Wales, where his party runs the government.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the First Minister of all people should know that Tarbolton is not in Wales, it's in Scotland. There is a workforce crisis in primary care services, and it is happening now. And it is happening here in Scotland. And it goes all the way back to the First Minister's door. We know that it takes at least 10 years to train to be a GP. And 10 years ago, the First Minister was the Health Secretary responsible. This winter saw the worst A&E performances on record. Thousands of patients waited over 4 hours for treatment. Last weekend, public health consultant Dr. Helene Irvin said, and I quote, "Many would not need to use A&E if they had timely access to a GP who knows them." First Minister, when will you accept that you can't claim that you are protecting Scotland's NHS if you are not protecting Scotland's local primary care services?
Minister. The point I'm making is that the NHS faces challenges in every single part of the UK. Health services face challenges in virtually every country in the world. We are putting record sums of money into our National Health Service. We have record numbers of people working in our National Health Service. We have increasing numbers of GPs and GPs in training, and that's why our health service is performing better. Yes, it's still facing challenges, but performing better than any other part of the UK. Richard Leonard wants to make this all about the SNP, which is why it is entirely legitimate to contrast and compare. Because he says, well, they don't like it either. He says, They say things would be better if the Tories were in power. He says things would be better if Labour were in power. So let's look at the reality here in Scotland. Richard Leonard mentioned A&E performance. In December last year, against the 4-hour target, the performance in Scotland was 81.6%. 81.6%. That is not good enough. In Tory England, though, it was 68.6%.
There you are.
68.6% where the Tories are running a government, and where Labour is running a government in Wales, it was 66.4%. So yes, our health service faces challenges, but all of the evidence says it's the SNP that is meeting those challenges better than any other party in the UK.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I encourage, I think Mr Russell and Mr Swinney in particular, just to, not of all the members. Exactly. Perhaps to set a ministerial example. Thank you. We'll have some constituency questions. The first from Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the major unplanned flaring incident at Mismoran last Thursday. The poor environmental rating published yesterday by SEPA, and of the walkout by some workers over reported concerns about health and safety. What assurances can the First Minister give to my constituents who remain very anxious about safety and about health and environmental impacts?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Annabel Ewing for raising what is an extremely important matter for her constituents, and ministers are in absolutely no doubt about the very understandable concerns of the local community, as evidenced by the number of complaints that SEPA has received regarding recent incidents. With regard to safety, the complex falls under the control of major accident hazards regulations. These are enforced by the Health and Safety Executive and SEPA, and we have been assured that both regulators continue to monitor the situation very closely. As things stand now, all of SEPA's published data suggests no breach of UK air quality standards. The Scottish Government is staying in very close contact with the regulators, but I hope members will appreciate it would not be appropriate for ministers to interfere in independent regulatory decisions. However, I absolutely recognise the seriousness of this issue, and I'm sure the Environment Secretary would be happy to keep Annabel Ewing and others who have an interest updated.
Mark Ruskell.
As the First Minister has just heard, this Moss-Moran plant is in crisis. Communities are suffering, workers are striking. Meanwhile, the Climate Change Secretary and the Energy Minister have both refused once again to meet with the local community at an emergency public meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. Will the First Minister ensure that the Government is represented at this meeting to explain to communities around Moss-Moran exactly what on earth is going on?
Minister.
Look, I'm very happy to consider any request of that nature that is made. I want to be very clear, though, it's not the case that ministers are refusing to attend a public meeting because they are not interested in this issue. There are regulatory enforcement actions underway right now, and it is important that ministers respect the independence of that process, and it would not really be in anybody's interest for ministers to step into territory that is rightly for SEPA and the Health and Safety Executive. But ministers understand and appreciate the seriousness of this issue. We will continue to keep in very close contact with the regulators and take whatever steps lie within our responsibilities to ensure that appropriate action is taken. And the Environment Secretary will be, as appropriate and as far as possible, be happy to keep interested members fully updated.
Gordon Lyndhurst, followed by Alec Rowley.
What is the First Minister's position on reports that the Quake project has offered so-called debenture schemes to corporate donors on what the project acknowledges as common good land here in Edinburgh?
First Minister.
These are, I believe, matters for local government. I'm very happy to look into issues that are raised appropriately in this chamber, and I'd be happy to write to the member once I've had the opportunity to do so.
Alec Rowley, to be followed by Emma Harper.
I have a constituent who has MS and who lost her higher rate mobility under the PIP 20-metre rule assessment. This meant she also lost her mobility car and her independence. The MS Society has been lobbying this government and this Parliament to scrap the discredited PIP 20-metre rule when we have the powers to do so. Will the First Minister, in the interest of dignity, fairness and respect, agree to scrap this discredited rule so that my constituent and all those who live with MS can do so with dignity?
First Minister.
have enormous sympathy with the issue that Alec Rowley has raised, and I hope he'll listen carefully to the answer I'm going to give. I am acutely aware, and the Government is acutely aware, that individuals with fluctuating conditions like MS are failed badly by the UK benefit system. All too often it acts as a real barrier to disabled people accessing the benefits that they are entitled to, and I know that particular concerns have been raised by the MS Society Scotland about the 20-metre rule and how mobility is currently assessed. We are carefully considering how the Scottish Government can better assess mobility to meet people's needs than is done currently, and we are absolutely determined to make improvements to the current system. But we also need to understand, and this is an important point, the potential effects that changing eligibility could have on access to other benefits that are not under the control of the Scottish Government, because PIP is used by the UK Government as a qualifying benefit for other benefits such as disability premiums. We are currently working closely with the UK Government to ensure that any changes we would want to make would not put at risk access to vital UK benefits and payments that remain reserved. But I hope that gives Alec Rowley an assurance that we are looking very carefully and very seriously at this issue, and doing so from a position of enormous sympathy to the argument that is being made.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Maurice Golden.
First Minister, given the lack of response from the UK Government to my repeated correspondence regarding progress with the investigation involving a near collision between a nuclear submarine and a passenger ferry leaving Cairnryan in November 2017, is the First Minister able to contact the UK Government to help me obtain a response to reassure my constituents that sufficient safety measures are in place to avoid this ever happening again? And more generally, does she agree with me that nuclear submarines have no place in Scotland or indeed anywhere around the world?
First Minister.
Well, I certainly look forward to the day when there are no nuclear weapons, not just in Scotland and the UK, but no nuclear weapons in the world. On the issue of safety, which I know is a huge concern to people, I'm certainly happy to ask the relevant Minister to contact the UK Government to seek the assurances that Emma Harper is looking for.
Maurice Golden, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Gledach Hotel in Renfrewshire has a slow internet connection which profoundly impacts their business. It would cost them an eye-watering £165,000 to install a fibre broadband connection from their local exchange, which they can't afford. Like all businesses, they were promised super-fast broadband by 2021, which won't be delivered. So can the First Minister set out what support there is for the Gledach Hotel to get a fibre connection as soon as possible?
First Minister.
To have Paul Wheelhouse look into the particular issue of Gledach Hotel and come back to the member on that. But on the general issue of broadband, of course, Paul Wheelhouse recently updated Parliament on the Government's plan. Our commitment to everybody having access to broadband by 2021 is being taken forward. Where that can't happen through the fibre programme, people will be offered vouchers. But on a matter that is actually substantially reserved, it is this Government that is going to be investing £600 million to provide super-fast broadband to every commercial and residential premise in the country at faster speeds than are available in any other part of the UK. This is a story of Tory failure in reserved matters that this SNP government is having to step in and fix.
Maurice Corrie.
Presiding Officer, the Ministry of Defence has recently invested £63 million into peer facilities at Glenmalon on Loch Long in my local area, which will create and sustain many jobs for the local community. Will the First Minister join me in welcoming this investment by the MOD to enable the United Kingdom's new aircraft carrier strike force to berth on the shores of Loch Long? And does she recognise the major investment that this brings to the Scottish economy?
First Minister.
I welcome investment in Scotland and the UK's conventional defences after many years where we've actually seen cuts to the conventional defence footprint here in Scotland. So I hope that that is something we will see continue, and I would take the opportunities, I'm sure all members would, to pay tribute to all those working in our armed forces.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
I agreed with the First Minister when she set out plans to expand nursery education. I agreed with the First Minister when she pledged that we needed quality, not just quantity. So can she tell me why her councillors in Edinburgh want to remove nursery teachers from this city's nurseries?
First Minister.
I should say, just as an aside, I don't actually remember Willie Rennie agreeing with me on these matters, but my memory may be failing me. I am absolutely committed. This government is committed to ensuring that we deliver the doubling of early years education and nursery provision. That is on track, and Parliament is kept regularly updated on that. And I absolutely agree that quality, not just quantity, is important. That's why, for example, the funding settlement supports payment of the living wage to make sure that we're attracting the best people into early years education. And we will continue to take forward these plans because they are not just in the benefit, for the benefit of young people across our country, but will save working families thousands of pounds every year.
Willie Rennie.
That was quite an astonishing dodge. In the last hour, Alison Murphy from the EIS appeared before the Council to describe the cuts to nursery teachers as the worst example of a short-term cut with devastating long-term impacts. This is an SNP council, half a mile up the road, led by our favourite council leader, on what the First Minister called the most important infrastructure project of this Parliament. We know nursery teachers raise the quality. The government's independent workforce review told us that. They help give children the best start in life and close the yawning inequality gap. But it's not just in Edinburgh. 40% of nursery teachers across Scotland have been chopped. We now find that if you have the best qualification as a teacher, you become too expensive to keep. What is the First Minister going to do about this terrible mistake on her big project by her own council? Will she call Adam McVeigh before it's too late?
First Minister.
Local authorities will take the decisions they think are right for their areas, and Willie Rennie constantly talks about the need to empower local authorities. But I'll talk about what this government is doing. This government is presiding over possibly the biggest expansion in the early years workforce that we have seen in the lifetime of this Parliament. Since 2017, we've created over 2,000 additional HNC places, over 800 graduate-level manager places. We've increased the number of qualified staff available. We're creating just under 2,000 additional college and university places. Uptake of early learning and childcare modern apprenticeships increased by 24% on the previous year, and we've got investment in the BA in childcare practice to make sure that we're upskilling the whole workforce. The fact is we're doubling childcare provision. We're seeing the employment of thousands of more workers in that sector. That's a good news story for children and parents across the country, which is why Willie Rennie can't quite bring himself to welcome it.
We have some further supplementary questions. The first from James Kelly, to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the publication of the Audit Committee's report this morning, highlighting the crisis in Scotland's prisons and the urgent action needed to address these issues. This follows on from years of underfunding of the Scottish Prison Service, which has resulted in 50% overcrowding at Barlinnie, where a lot of prisoners are doubling up in single occupancy cells. We also see illness and mental health issues on the rise among prison officers, and really seriously, the number of deaths in prisons is at 258 between 2008 and 2018. First Minister, these are really serious issues that have been consistently raised. We've had a lot of words and platitudes. When are we going to get some action?
First Minister.
Well, let me talk about action. The budget plans that we announced 2 weeks ago committed an additional £50 million for our prisons. That included a £30 million increase in revenue funding for staffing and other operational costs, and a 43% increase in capital funding, a £20 million increase in capital funding. We're investing in the prison estate, prioritising, of course, the female custodial estate. We're progressing with plans for a replacement of Barlinnie and development of HMP Highland to replace HMP Inverness. So that investment is strong, and rightly so. But of course, the core challenge that our prison faces is a prison population that is too high. Too many people right now are in prisons that would be better punished elsewhere. And when I say better, I mean better for them and for reducing their risk of reoffending, but better for society as a whole. That's why we're also taking forward a range of reforms. We've extended the presumption against short sentences, expanded access to electronic monitoring, and invested in bail supervision as an alternative to remand. And actually, since November, when the committee was considering these issues, we've already seen prisoner numbers reduce by around 200 because of the actions we are taking. So that's good progress. We will not be complacent. We will continue to invest and reform to make sure that we've got a safe prison service, which we do right now, and that continues, but also that we are providing justice services that are in the interests of society overall.
Richard Lyle, to be followed by Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, in light of the widespread criticism by Scottish industry and employers of the UK Government's immigration proposals, can the First Minister outline what response UK ministers have made to proposals for a Scottish visa?
First Minister.
Well, shamefully, UK ministers have dismissed at this stage out of hand the constructive proposals that the Scottish Government has made around a Scottish visa. The proposals that were published on immigration yesterday are wrong in principle. They take people who care for us in our care homes and hospitals, people who farm our land, who process our fish, who build our houses, who look after our tourists, serve us in our restaurants and hotels. They brand these people as low-skilled and imply that they are not welcome here. It is shocking and shameful, and I think it should be opposed. But these proposals are also devastating for the future of our economy. Our demographics mean we need to continue to attract people to come here, and this will make it so much harder. These proposals will make Scotland poorer in the future. They are the biggest risk to our economic prosperity that we face right now. I read in the newspapers this morning that the Scottish Tories are livid about these proposals. So they should be. But rather than being quietly livid, shouldn't the Scottish Tories be standing up for Scotland and doing something about it?
Andy Whiteman, to be followed by Monica Lennon. Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased that the First Minister does agree that the language and policy on immigration from the UK Government this week is deeply damaging. So does she agree with me that a clear signal that Scotland is more welcoming would be to give those who are seeking asylum here the right to vote in today's Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill?
First Minister.
Well, obviously Parliament will debate these issues this afternoon. The Scottish Government has set out its careful and very considered position on that, and we obviously come from the perspective of wanting to see asylum seekers welcomed here, given the right to work here and play a full part in our society. So we carefully consider all of these issues. But I am very proud of the fact that in Scotland, I hope we have cross-party consensus for the fact that people who live here, generally speaking, no matter where they come from, should have the right to vote in our elections and make a full contribution to the kind of country we are and want to be.
And Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is aware that thousands of bereaved families are facing agonising delays to find out why their loved ones have died. The Crown Office has now told families it could take a whole year before they receive a final post-mortem report. These families are living with the trauma of a sudden or unexplained death, and they feel failed and abandoned. They were relieved when the First Minister told the Chamber last month that this injustice has her full attention. Can the First Minister advise what action has been taken to end these shocking and cruel delays, and will she meet with some of the families who are coming to Parliament in the coming weeks to hear firsthand how it is affecting them?
Minister.
Well, these are obviously principally matters for the Lord Advocate and the law officers. I discuss these issues regularly with the Lord Advocate. I will see the Lord Advocate indeed later today, and issues around the toxicology delays that we have talked about before will certainly be matters that he updates me on. And that there have been investments made and work is ongoing to deal with that issue. The other issue that has been raised previously in this chamber is delays to fatal accident inquiries. I've set out before the issues that the law officers have to deal with there, and I know that it is in everybody's interest that these decisions are taken as quickly as possible. I would be very happy to ask the Lord Advocate to update Monica Lennon on these issues and answer any further questions that she has.
Thank you. Question number 4, Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what concerns the Scottish Government has regarding difficulties that people with visual impairment can have in accessing medical services because a digital by default approach is increasingly being used.
First Minister.
The Charter of Patient Rights and Responsibilities makes clear that everyone should be given information about their treatment and care in a format or language that meets their needs. The Charter was revised last summer. We've written to all NHS boards to remind them of their responsibilities under it. We've made clear our commitment to support children and adults who have sight loss to access the health services and social care they need through our See Here strategy.
Christine Graham.
Thank the First Minister for answer. However, this does seem to be an issue across Scotland. For example, Newbattle GP Practice, serving my constituents, has adopted e-consult as the means of securing a GP appointment, with only a few exceptions. So constituents have expressed concern that this presents difficulties for them due to visual and other impairments. Does the First Minister agree with me that while these online systems do have their place, they are not the be-all and end-all, and that accessible alternatives must be readily available depending on the needs of the individual patient? Otherwise, this system can act as a barrier with unintended consequences, such as patients having no option but to use A&E instead.
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that. It should be clear to any practice and indeed to any health board that their appointment systems must be accessible to all people, regardless of their circumstances. Like Christine Graham, I believe there is a place for e-booking systems, but we must encourage health boards to ensure that where someone has difficulties using the internet, that they can call and speak to someone in person. I'll ask the Health Secretary to look at this particular case and engage with the Health Board to ensure that the principles that are outlined in the Patients' Right Charter are being fully implemented.
Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the First Minister agrees with me that if we deploy some fairly simple technology properly, we can ensure that sections of the community, such as people who are visually impaired, can be confident in participating fully in society. And if so, what will the Scottish Government do to enable that deployment?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that, and the Scottish Government works with health boards to enable the deployment of existing and new technologies, and the principles that I've been speaking about in the Patients' Rights Charter are very important. It is incumbent on health boards, whether through technology or in other ways, to make sure that their services are accessible, and we will continue to make sure that health boards realise and live up to those responsibilities.
Question number 5, Jamie Green.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in response to reports that the number of people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes has risen by 40% in the last 10 years.
First Minister.
Reducing the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is a priority. In 2018, we published the Type 2 Diabetes Framework, which sets out measures to make a significant impact on prevention and remission by improving support with people with or at risk of type 2 diabetes. Since then, we've invested an additional £4.5 million to give people better access to weight management services to support effective and sustained changes to diet and lifestyle. As Diabetes Scotland said last week, creating healthy environments which support people to make healthier choices is also critical. That's why the Diet and Healthy Weight Delivery Plan sets out over 60 broad-ranging actions to make it easier for people to eat well and have a healthy weight.
Amy Green.
Can I thank the First Minister for those comments and also add my support for the great work that Diabetes Scotland does. But the reality is that type 2 diabetes is on the rise. This is a worrying trend, and the number of people diagnosed with it in Scotland is over 250,000. But there are estimates there are up to 26,000 Scots living with the condition that have not yet been diagnosed. The majority of these new cases will be linked to obesity. But the good news is that type 2 diabetes is not just treatable, but preventable, and in many cases reversible with the right mix of medication, diet and lifestyle changes. So in light of that, can I ask the First Minister what specifically has been done to identify these undiagnosed cases so these people can be treated? What is the Government doing to improve the treatment of those currently living with the condition? But more importantly, does the First Minister believe that it was a mistake to scrap the flagship policy of health checks for 40-year-olds in Scotland, because that removes that vital opportunity to identify these potential cases at an earlier age?
First Minister.
We encourage early detection and diagnosis across a range of conditions, and I think the member is absolutely right to focus on the importance of that. I'm sure he has read the framework for prevention, early detection and early intervention, which deliberately looks at all of these different strands. Prevention is really important. That's why the healthy environment that Diabetes Scotland talks about is important, enabling and supporting people to eat healthily, to maintain a healthy weight, but also early detection. And I'm certainly happy to get the Health Secretary to provide more details of how that aspect of the framework has been taken forward, because as in this condition, as with any condition, if it is not diagnosed and detected, then treating it, and in the case of diabetes, as the member rightly says, possibly reversing it, is not possible. So these are all important areas of priority, and that's why they are focused on in that very deliberate way in the framework.
And David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be well aware that Scotland has one of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in Europe and costs the NHS £1 billion a year in avoidable complications. 1 in 10 hospital bed days relate to diabetes. Does the First Minister share my view that we need radical and immediate action to reduce the long-term complications of diabetes, a condition that maims, blinds and kills?
First Minister.
In general terms, yes, I do. Obviously, the specifics here are important, and I think, as Dave Stewart knows, because of his long-standing interest in this must mean action across a range of different areas, as I've just been talking about. Prevention remains the most important focus in many respects. That's why, for example, we are going to, within this Parliament, bring forward the Restricting Foods Promotion Bill to help make sure that people are supported to eat healthily, but also treatment is important, and there is a lot of investment and a lot of effort in our National Health Service to make sure that people have early access to the best possible treatment. So I appreciate Dave Stewart's interest in this, and I know he is aware of the actions that are underway, and the Health Secretary and others within the government are always willing to have discussions about what more we can do to prevent people getting diabetes and then support them to live with it in a way that hopefully sees it reversed, or at the very least managed without further complications.
Question number 6, Jackie Bailey.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to prepare the NHS to deal with coronavirus.
First Minister.
As it stands today, there are still no confirmed cases of coronavirus in Scotland. However, it is clearly prudent to assume that this will change in the days and weeks ahead. Our NHS is well prepared to respond to disease outbreaks and has tried and tested measures in place for managing public health incidents of this type. Health Protection Scotland and the Scottish Government continue to work closely with boards on their preparedness for managing potential cases. Health Protection Scotland has already produced specific guidance on the investigation and initial management of suspected cases, which has been communicated to boards via a letter from the Chief Medical Officer. The establishment of testing facilities in Edinburgh and Glasgow has enabled quicker notification of results. The Scottish Government is encouraging organisations to ensure business continuity plans are refreshed in light of coronavirus, and we're also promoting good respiratory hygiene practices to minimise the risk of catching and spreading it.
Jackie Bailey.
I welcome the First Minister's response. The spread of coronavirus has been rapid and the numbers affected have increased quite dramatically. And whilst we don't yet have any cases infected in Scotland, it is just a matter of time. On that basis, can the First Minister tell me what additional planning has been undertaken to ensure that there is sufficient infection control staff, additional isolation facilities and sufficient bed capacity in our already overstretched hospitals to cope with the virus?
Minister.
Well, can I say firstly to Jackie Bailey that I do think it is right that it is a matter of time before we see cases here. There is still a lot of learning underway about this virus, who it affects most severely, how it spreads, the rate of infection, and that knowledge is developing almost every day at the moment. In terms of preparedness, we are currently using sensibly the pandemic flu plan to assess and prepare resources and response planning. Health Protection Scotland has produced clinical and laboratory guidance for investigation and initial management, which I spoke about earlier on. We are also looking very carefully at the resources that health boards have and need, and how they would require to redeploy resources in the event of a serious outbreak of coronavirus. We have activated the Scottish Government Resilience Room to support these efforts. I chaired a first meeting of that on the 29th of January. So as this situation develops, well, two two things. I want to assure the Chamber that plans are well underway and well developed, but as this situation develops, the Health Secretary, of course, will take steps to keep Parliament fully updated.
Thank you very much, and that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on shortly to a members' business debate in the name of Maurice Golden on tackling climate change, the role of Scottish agriculture.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.